Released in the early days of the PlayStation 2, Gungriffon Blaze is a mech-based combat game developed by Game Arts, a studio well known for its contributions to the role-playing and action genres. Game Arts had previously made a name for itself with titles like Grandia and Luna, Silver Star Story, games known for their narrative depth and compelling character development. Shifting to a mech-based action game might have seemed a curious move for the studio, but their foray into this genre would become another noteworthy entry in their portfolio.
Gungriffon Blaze was released in Japan on August 3, 2000, just a few months before the PlayStation 2's worldwide launch, showcasing the platform's capabilities in the early stages. It was developed as a spiritual sequel to the Gungriffon series that initially debuted on the Sega Saturn in the mid-1990s. The first Gungriffon, developed by Game Arts and published by Sega, stood out on the Saturn as a solid mech combat game that combined vehicular warfare with first-person shooter elements. It was praised for its strategic gameplay and detailed mechanics. With Gungriffon Blaze, Game Arts sought to modernize the series for a new generation of gamers, taking advantage of the superior hardware of the PlayStation 2. The development was clearly aimed at delivering a more immersive mech experience, introducing larger battlefields, improved AI, and enhanced visuals that utilize the hardware to create a greater sense of scale. While it might not have reached the same heights of acclaim as some of Game Arts' more narrative-driven titles, Gungriffon Blaze maintained a loyal fanbase and a respected position among early PlayStation 2 releases.
The gameplay of Gungriffon Blaze can be best described as a hybrid between a first-person shooter and a vehicular combat game, making it relatively accessible for players who might not be deeply familiar with more complex mech simulators like Mech Warrior or Armored Core. Unlike those games, which often involved intricate systems of customization and tactical combat, Gungriffon Blaze opted for a more straightforward approach to its controls and gameplay. The game's controls, though not perfect by today's standards, were certainly passable for the time. Piloting the game's titular mech, known as the High-Max, offered a sense of weight and power that was common in the mech genre, but without becoming overly cumbersome. Movement felt fluid enough, with players able to make use of both ground-based dashing and limited flight capabilities, which added an extra layer of mobility to combat. However, the control scheme might have felt clunky to players who weren't familiar with the genre's conventions, such as aiming while managing the bulk of a mech's movement, but for its time, it struck a good balance between accessibility and immersion. Gungriffon Blaze's HUD heads-up display also contributed to its accessible gameplay. While perhaps cluttered by modern standards, it provided clear and functional feedback to the player, showing everything from target locks to weapon status without feeling overwhelming. However, it required players to adjust to its information-rich display, something that was par for the course in mech games. One of the key features that helped Gungriffon Blaze stand out was the variety of locations and combat environments. Players were not confined to one type of battlefield, but were instead treated to an array of terrains, ranging from urban landscapes to deserts, mountains, and even snowy regions. These settings were not just window dressing. Each environment impacted the gameplay in subtle but meaningful ways. For example, urban environments provided cover opportunities but also required more tactical movement to avoid getting pinned down, while open deserts gave more space for long-range engagements but exposed players to more aggressive enemy attacks. In addition to the terrain, the game featured a healthy variety of enemy types, from foot soldiers to tanks, helicopters, and other mechs. These encounters were designed to keep players engaged by requiring different strategies depending on the situation, whether it be high-speed dashes to avoid airstrikes or carefully planned ambushes to take out ground forces.
By the standards of 2000, Gungriffon Blaze presented a competent graphical package, even if it wasn't the best the PS2 would ultimately offer. The game's environments were functional if not overly detailed, and the mechs themselves were well designed, conveying a sense of real-world plausibility in their size and movement. Explosions and weapon effects added excitement to battles, although they could sometimes feel visually overwhelming, especially when multiple effects were happening simultaneously on screen. A unique and somewhat ahead of its time feature that Gungriffon Blaze included was the option to change the type of explosions, which could help reduce eye strain and was an important consideration for players with epilepsy. This showed an early awareness of accessibility concerns, something that many other titles at the time did not address. It was a subtle but important aspect that helped make the game more accessible to a broader audience.
In many ways, Gungriffon Blaze drew inspiration from earlier mech games, particularly the Armored Core series, which had already established itself on the original PlayStation by this time. Both games featured mech-based combat, but while Armored Core focused heavily on customization and a deep, strategic approach to battles, Gungriffon Blaze leaned more into fast-paced action with less emphasis on fine-tuning your mech's loadout. This made Gungriffon Blaze more accessible to casual players, who may have found the complexity of Armored Core intimidating. Another comparable game from the same era was Zone of the Enders, also released for the PlayStation 2. While Zone of the Enders opted for a faster, more anime-inspired take on mech combat, Gungriffon Blaze retained a grounded, military-style approach. The difference in pace and presentation helped to distinguish Gungriffon Blaze from other titles of the era, positioning it as more of a simulation than a high-octane arcade experience. Gungriffon Blaze brought some unique features to the mech combat genre that helped it stand out. Chief among these was the balance it struck between being accessible to casual players and providing enough depth for fans of the genre. The straightforward control scheme and approachable gameplay made it a solid entry point for players who may not have had experience with the complexities of games like MechWarrior or Armored Core. Moreover, the variety of mission locations and the inclusion of a range of enemies added a refreshing level of challenge without feeling overly punishing. Additionally, the ability to modify visual effects for accessibility was a thoughtful addition that gave the game a progressive edge.
Gungriffon Blaze might not be the most well-remembered title from the PlayStation 2's early years, but it still holds a place as a solid, if unremarkable, mech combat game that bridged the gap between accessibility and depth. Its blend of shooter mechanics and vehicular combat, along with varied environments and passable controls, made it an enjoyable experience for both casual players and mech enthusiasts. While it might not have been as revolutionary as some of its contemporaries, Gungriffon Blaze laid the groundwork for future improvements in its sequels and contributed to the growth of the mech genre in gaming history.